How to Create a Glitch Monologues Season 17 Chapter 5. This is Season 17 of How to Create a Glitch in the Matrix Monologues Episode 5. In this episode, we will be talking about the cycles of history in broader terms. Specifically, in past episodes we talked about how eras from the past are recapitulated in the present through emotional calibration. This idea essentially involves individuals being calibrated to a particular era in the past through stylistic or aesthetic trends in film, television, fashion and media. While these trends are initiated, and compelled, by the system, to eliminate entropy and divert entropy, causing individuals into archetypes of historical prominence, further to the channeling of societal stresses into ideological conflicts that can be resolved through historical precedent. These trends are also the result of emotional calibration between generations, in families, through rationalizations applied to younger generations from older generations. For example, I may decide to wear my hair in a top bun, or top knot, due to the observation of one of my parents that I remind them of themselves at a particular age, when that style was common. These aren't conscious decisions but are rather unconscious decisions made due to reinforcement provided within social systems. Now, movements or trends within systems promulgate dialectically as well. The dialectical progression which governs indirect ground, or deference, manifests on a larger scale as cycles or movements of history. Thus, it is not coincidence that a conservative time will follow a liberal era and vice versa. These movements of history are generated by a progression of the narrative and the recapitulation of the past in the present. But these cycles or movements work their way through the system from the individual to the group down to up, manifesting differently in each era. I.e., the left movement of the 1960s led to the abolition of segregation in the 1960s in the United States but led to the election of Barack Obama in the 2010s. These two distinct manifestations of the resolution of the narrative are obviously different in their effect, but correspond to a similar dialectical shift occurring in two different eras. The time it takes for these movements, so to speak, to reoccur is largely a factor of the generational gap between a parent and offspring generation. So, for example, the 50 years between the 1960s and the 2010s is approximately the time between the age of maturity for two generations, 20 years old. As each older generation rationalizes its younger counterpart similarly, it manifests in repetitious patterns every so often. Now, these movements in history also correspond to paradigms, and likewise paradigms correspond to junction points in history. When two ideologically opposed ideas exist in contradiction, the resolution of that contradiction manifests a paradigm shift. Just as the tonic and dominant exist in contradiction until the postural release, which resolves the tension. In the last episode, we talked about how intellectual attachment manifests as acts of physical possession. What I neglected to mention is how this reflects the gradual involution of the consensual. As physical contact, which is consensual, produces emission of a consensual reality, that is, a reality in which our expectations are matched and our internal monologue remains extant, the gradual reaffirmation of attachment through physical acts of touching represents the re-establishment of a consensual reality. These repetitious cycles have much in common with the dialectical movements of history, on the larger scale, and deference, on the smaller scale. That is to say, that ideological movements reflect the gradual resurrection and extinguishment of the consensual. Thus, one can see that the cycling of movements begins in the local and expands to the global and returns to the local once the non-consensual intervenes, cycling the movements of history through these two forms of reality. That's the end of the podcast for today. If you enjoyed it, please like, comment and subscribe.